When you're protecting the power grid, you can't wait for patient zero. You have to hunt for the behavior, not the malware. This is Mind Over Malware. Up next, we have Mind Over Malware, behavioral profiling to safeguard critical infrastructure. Now, this is with Cameron Malin. He is a former FBI profiler, and he's been giving us his time at our virtual conferences, kind of tailoring each of these talks to our specific conference. So this one is all about critical infrastructure, and he's going to give us some good insights because this matters because the motivations for the attackers in critical infrastructure are different. Folks that want to shut off our power and water are different than the ones that just want to steal our money, right? So we're going to dig into a couple of different cases with Cameron and see what the story is with those. And hopefully you guys learn some stuff about the motivations that these bad guys have. So we'll catch up with him after the presentation, but enjoy.
Tom, thanks so much. It is great to be here at Secure World Critical Infrastructure Virtual Conference. What a great conference. Fantastic speakers lined up, fantastic talks. I'm excited to be a part of it, and I'm excited to be someone who gets to watch the other talks. And I'm happy to share with you a very interesting talk on mind over malware, behavioral profiling to safeguard critical infrastructure. And this talk is going to look at a couple of cases as the lens in which to assess behavioral profiling efforts in critical infrastructure cases. And I thought these two cases that we'll use as the foundation help explain and look at facets of these attacks that normally aren't talked about. By background, I am a behavioral profiler, and I was in the FBI for 21 years, the first 10 of which in the Los Angeles division as a cyber agent. I then was selected for the behavioral analysis unit in Virginia, and I was there from 2012 to 2023 as the last 11 years of my career. As part of the BAU, I was the creator and developer of a capability for assessing cyber adversaries known as the Cyber Behavioral Analysis Center, and then also the developer of what's known as the DIG, or the Deception and Influence Group, which is a smaller cadre of profilers specializing in adversary deception, influence, disinformation, and information operations. I'm currently in a number of consultancies that I founded. Modus Cyberandi, which is a boutique behavioral profiling consultancy. You can find me there at moduscyberandi.com. And then also Cyber Labs, which is a cyber deception, deepfake, and synthetic media analysis consultancy. Number of tools to assess cyber adversary deepfake behaviors, deepfake tabletop exercises, deepfake red teaming, and an assessment platform for deepfake threat intelligence known as the Deepfake Dashboard. So behavioral profiling, it's often seen as maybe only for violent crime, but the reality is that behavioral profiling can also help identify the major personality, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral characteristics of an offender based on the crimes that he or she committed. And this would also, in cyber context, have equal efficacy, but also to assessing groups and cyber adversaries that have a larger group component and dynamic. And in doing that, I'd like to use a couple of different case studies and lenses as a way of doing that. And the first one we're going to look at is the Norway dam attack that happened earlier this year. And then very recently, there was an attack on St. Paul, Minnesota, the city of St. Paul, and their critical infrastructure. So these are two critical infrastructure attacks that really help us dissect and understand the behavioral components and adversary assessment components, aside from the technical elements that happened. So if we go back to April of this year, the Norway federal police and their intelligence services came out and said that Russia had gotten into one of their dams, and the dam was used for. There was some conflicting information about this, but there was a fish hatchery, and it was used for food sources, and it was a very critical dam. But the thing about this that was so bizarre is that the attackers got into the control panel, opened the floodgates, and released over 1,900,000 gallons of water. This was almost 2 gallons of water, and the way they were looking at this is 132 gallons of a second for 4 hours in duration before it was stopped. And again, the way this was done, it was a remote attack. It was done through a computer intrusion to the control panel. And again, when we think of ICS or industrial control systems or critical infrastructure, certainly water falls under that category, sustainable resources like food and fish hatcheries. So doing this, when you start looking at what was the point of this, this is where we're going to start digging into the types of attacks that use an information operation standpoint. Interestingly, Beate Ganges, who's the head of Norway's Police Security Service, or the PST, gave a number of quotes on what this attack was. And I think the most salient for our talk today is that the aim of this type of operation is to influence and to cause fear and chaos among the general population. That is very stirring, and we're going to return to that. Again, the aim of this type of operation is to influence and cause fear and chaos among the general population. I now want to pivot to the St. Paul, Minnesota attack. That also was a critical infrastructure attack, and that was very recent. That was in July of this year. And when this attack happened, all kinds of critical infrastructure was affected. They had to basically take everything offline. And St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter gave a press conference on this, and we'll return to that in a little bit. But one of the quotes he had is, "We now know this was not a system glitch or technical error. This was a deliberate, coordinated digital attack carried out by a sophisticated external actor, intentionally and criminally targeting our city's information infrastructure." So a pretty potent quote here, quite disturbing to hear something like that. I want to turn back to the intentionality when we start dissecting the pathway of these attacks. I think it's really important here. So with the St. Paul attack, what we learned is that this was conducted by a group, a really new group, interestingly, and that's always someone who analyzes cyber adversaries and group behaviors. We start looking at just like groups popping up out of nowhere. This is called Interlock, and they run a dark web site for their data leaks and extortion scams with this. It's called Worldwide Secrets Blog, and they have a mission statement that seems to be quasi altruistic, which is a very common thing. Is, you know, we're trying to punish those people that don't take security serious. No, that is not really what they're trying to do, but this is at least the stated mission statement. The site is pretty sophisticated and slick. It's not your average kind of lame dark web site. This particular attack ended up causing St. Paul to go into a state of emergency. And I'll show you the orders and the releases just explaining how that happened. But St. Paul, even as of today, this website, you know, I took a screenshot of it just the other day. It is still responding to this, and they finally have emergency services fully operational, but this has been on the site since this incident in July. The FBI also, and along with CISA, also released a interlock alert and a security advisory. And if you're looking for that, the alert code is on this screenshot, but it's all about interlock, and it came out, you know, right around the time that this particular attack happened because it was such a pernicious attack. What we learned from this is that interlock has been around, according to this assessment, since 2024, and it has impacted a wide range of businesses, and notably it has been assessed that they're targeting critical infrastructure sectors in North America and Europe. There's a lot of the rest of the world missing in those target sets. And that's just something when you're looking at targeting, why is it only North America and Europe that are being hit by this critical infrastructure attack set? It leverages a double extortion model. If you're familiar with that, they want a ransom fee to unlock the encrypted data, and then also another ransom so that they don't leak or sell the information online. And the ransom note includes the demand, it provides instruction, and there's this interesting unique code. It sends you over to an onion URL, and then you have to go on your Tor browser over there and engage with the threat actors. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Here is the note that we see that you receive when this type of attack happens. I've done some psycholinguistics on this note compared to other notes. It's really not relevant to this talk, but there's some interesting features in here that sort of play upon other notes, but then there's some newer content as well. When you go to the URL, the onion URL, you see this worldwide secrets blog, and the title that they give it is "The Corporate Secrets They Never Wanted You to See." And I think that from an advertising and branding standpoint, it's very interesting that they're choosing a catchphrase for their group. Again, moving towards more sophisticated methodologies of messaging and brand, and making logos for interlock. There's a special logo for it. So this isn't just like your average attack. Now, other groups do this, but it's just notable that this looks like an average corporate website, weirdly enough. There are a couple areas I want to explore. There's the chat with support and then the data leak section. Chat with support, what happens is you go to this onion URL, you get your token and your organization ID in the extortion and ransom note that is left, and then you have to go to chat and with the unique token, and then you start talking and negotiating from there. The other area that's interesting is the data leaks section. The data leak section for this particular entry, there's a myriad of different. I've made sure to obfuscate everything here that's sensitive, the URL, their data. And then there's just a description on the website of St. Paul. They do describe the file size and the number of files and folders, so they do that as a way of proof of existence of what they did. And they do kind of a biography in the middle piece there in gray font of what the victim is, and then there's a way of getting that data if you so choose to execute the button to the right. There's another area that really isn't relevant to the attack, but it is relevant to the group, going back to the idea of branding, messaging, and kind of how the group holds itself out there. There is a contact button here. There's a general mailbox they give, an email address that's a anonymous email. But specifically, they're saying that if you're a journalist, blogger, or have access to corporate networks, we'd love to connect with you. For any inquiries, or if you encounter issues with our website, feel free to reach out at the email provided. Again, sort of a corporate way of speaking and looking for engagement with journalists and bloggers. And outside of victim sets, they're looking to engage and get their name out there. It's sort of an interesting evolution in what we're seeing in these ransomware groups. As I mentioned, this attack ended up causing a number of executive orders and emergency orders. This is the order that was issued by Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, and essentially this order describes what happened and the need for services and Guard coming in, and the National Guard helping with the incident so that they can remediate it and get everything back online. The same thing goes a few days later. Mayor Carter from St. Paul declared a state of emergency. Same idea. It's sort of hand in glove here with the governor than the mayor, and it's very much tracks the language and the talk he gave during his press conference, which was a very alarming press conference. You could hear the distress in many of the reporters' questions, and they were concerned. I mean, the way he laid it out there, gave a good press conference, was very straightforward. But because it was so straightforward and because he elucidated a lot of the facts surrounding the incident, it caused reporters to be very concerned. And then lastly, a few days later, St. Paul ends up putting out an extension of the emergency, the state of emergency. So this is another 90 days that was put out there, and as I showed you from the website, we're you can still see that they're in that state. It's on the actual St. Paul website. So they're still feeling the effects of this particular attack. And when you start thinking of motivations and intentions, if it were sheerly financial, is this really what the adversary is aiming to do, is cause this protracted state of emergency? So it's important, I think, that we start looking at the underpinnings of these types of attacks, and I'm specifically going to do it through the lens of some Russian information operation theory, because when we look at the dam attack, Norway attributed it to Russia. I think, with that said, a lot of these ransomware groups have origins, connectivity, or collusion with Russian threat actors, criminal and otherwise, and it's sort of a gray hybridized area of cyber attacks. And so the main principle when you start looking at these critical infrastructure attacks is this idea of something known as reflexive control. And this is a term to describe a primarily Russian information warfare technique and objective. It's the practice of predetermining an adversary's decision in your favor by altering key factors in the adversary's perception of the world. And again, this is something that originated from the Soviet Union, and I'll show you how it originated. And it's basically neutralizing an adversary's strength by causing him to choose a course of action that aligns with Russia's objectives and not the host country's objectives. And this was created by Vladimir Lefevre, and he was a mathematical psychologist in the Soviet Union. He eventually came over to the United States in the 80s to California as a professor at one of the UC schools. And he had this mathematical approach to social psychology. It was known as reflexive theory. In fact, if you're interested in this, you can still get his publications. The most salient that is very hard to get, very hard to find, is his 1984 book, Reflexive Control, the Soviet Concept of Influencing an Adversary's Decision-Making Process. You can't find that one. That one is, if you can find that one, I want someone to connect with me, because it's very hard to find. But you can find 2 of his books, or 3 of his books, on Leaf and Oak Publishers. And those may even be on Amazon. That would include a book called Lectures on Reflexive Game Theory and another one called Conflicting Structures. All of these have chapters specifically on reflexive control. But he developed this theory as a military researcher when he was in the Soviet Union, and continued looking at that theory once he emigrated to the United States. There's been a lot of other papers out there. Some of the best, I would argue, just like summation of it, would be Keir Giles, James Schur, and Chatham House's Russian Reflexive Control paper for the Defense Research and Development Canada program. Fantastic, really robust article on Russian reflexive control. So again, it's there's material out there for you to look at and learn more about this. But Sergei Komov, a Russian who was with the Soviet Union in the military, published a series of works that really were translated out from Russian into English. And so scholars looked at this and said, okay, well, what are the Russians trying to do here? And what he's saying is that reflexive control is trying to accomplish a series of intentions and goals. It could be transferring the image of a situation. So it's like, for instance, providing an opponent with an erroneous or incomplete image of a situation. It could be the creation of a goal for an opponent where it puts the victim country or victim group in a position where they have to select a goal in Russia's favor. It could be to form a goal by transferring an image of the situation. So, for instance, feigning weakness when you create a false picture. It could be transferring an image of one's own perception of a situation. And here it's providing an adversary or a host country that you're attacking with false information or portions of the truth based on one's own perception of the situation. And then lastly, transferring an image of one's own goal. And this is basically feinting techniques or misdirection techniques, transferring an image of one's own doctrine, and this is giving false views of procedures and algorithms for decision making. And then lastly, transferring one's own image of a situation to make the opponent deduce his own goal. So this is perception management and perception shaping techniques. And all of these are meant to align with Russian objectives and to cause the targeted victim to form the wrong decisions that favor Russia. Komov also described the objectives, and particularly he said, look, these are mutually supporting, and these can be waged among different cognitive and affective axes. And affective just means emotional. The ways that he described these, there are 12 or 10 that he laid out, and that would include distraction, division, pacification, overload, decision paralysis, deterrence, suggestion, provocation, exhaustion, and deception. So there's all these ways of causing the victim who is attacked to have an injection of chaos and cognitive strain and overload to make the wrong decision-making processes. So interestingly, none of this has to do with money. None of this has to do with fame. None of this has to do with ego. This is a information warfare set of constructs, and that's an important thing. So when you start thinking of these attacks on Norway's dams, and you go back to the head of PST's service and what she said about what it's meant to cause, all of a sudden a light bulb goes off. So let's look a little more on where this falls. If you think of reflexive control, it encompasses a number of different Russian information operation tactics. Maskirovka, which is deception, disinformation, provocation, diversion, and active measures, which is a political information warfare tactic from many, many years ago. This was a term that was created in the 80s and still carries on today. Now, I want to fast forward now to 2013, and I want to be careful here. This is colloquially known as the Gerasimov Doctrine, and this is a work or quotes attributed to General of the Russian Army, Valery Gerasimov, who's very high up in the military. He gave some statements. Now it's attributed, and it was translated into English. It came out in a publication, the Military Review, the early 2016 edition, and it's translations of some things that Gerasimov said. But I think it's important. I don't know if it's necessarily a doctrine. It's sort of described that way or labeled that way. I think it's just important to say Gerasimov said these things, and we have to interpret and look at what his intentions are, necessarily putting a label on it. So he says, the very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means in achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases, they have exceeded the power of forces of weapons and their effectiveness. All of this is supplemented by military means of a concealed character. Now, notably, the things that he is saying here is hacking an enemy's society rather than attacking it head on. I'll say it again, hacking an enemy's society rather than attacking it head on. Chaos is a part of the strategy, and he specifies that the objective is to achieve an environment of permanent unrest and conflict within an enemy state. And this particular set of constructs that he lays out builds upon the framework of information warfare and cyber psyop tools. And he declared in this sort of set of statements that non-military tactics are not necessarily auxiliary anymore, and that this should be the preferred way to win versus use of force. So I'll let that sink in, but many of you may not know about these underpinnings of how information warfare work from there. But when you see attacks against critical infrastructure where it causes societal shutdown, it causes chaos, it causes fear, it causes what do we do now with all of our critical infrastructure services? Is it motivated by money? Is that the only reason they're doing this? Is ransomware, is Colonial Pipeline, JBS food processing, were those done just to get cryptocurrency? Or was it also to cause chaos and a major vein of industry, gasoline, and American way of life to be affected? And I'll let you cogitate on that, but it's just something to consider in these attacks. And now what I want to do is I want to pivot to the pathway to cyber attack. And these are the steps that an adversary takes when constructing and executing a cyber attack. And what I'm going to do here, I haven't done this in other talks, is I'm going to show where reflexive control and these information warfare principles live in this pathway. The pathway itself is adapted and created based on the need for breaking down the pre-offense, offense, and post-offense behaviors that cyber threat actors take when they move from an idea all the way to an attack and then post-attack. What's notable is that the first 5 stages or steps in an attack do not involve necessarily putting hands on keyboard. It has the phases of motivation, ideation, intention, conceptualization, research, and planning. And I'm going to describe all these for you momentarily, but just for purposes of giving you a high-level overview of this pathway, I thought it would be important to show the distinctions here, because this really relates to the cognitive aspects, the cerebral levels, thinking, feeling, and choices, whereas the last 4 stages are actually going to revolve around adversary actions. So that would be preparation, reconnaissance, probing, and breach, attack, and post-attack. None of those happen without this first 5 stages of the cognitive elements. It's important to note that the same idea here applies to pre-offense, offense, and post-offense. These are temporal aspects of an attack. That before someone actually goes live on keyboard and launches whatever this attack is, there's this whole series of things that happen before the attack. It's known as pre-offense behaviors. And then the attack actually happens. That's the offense. And then there's post-attack behaviors. It's known as post-offense. Very traditional behavioral profiling, temporal context principles applied very naturally to cyber attacks. During that pre-offense stage, what we would expect to see is an origination phase, meaning the inception of an attack, development of an attack, and then refinement before it's actually launched. So if you look at artifacts from digital forensics and incident response, cyber threat intelligence, you will see normally that a pre-offense area would include origination, development, and so let's start looking at motivation first. Motivation is the underlying activator, purpose, or sustained reasons for why a cyber threat actor wants to conduct an attack. And the way I would best describe this is the motivation is the why behind the attack. Motivations are often studied. There's different ways motivation is looked at. There's entire psychology courses on this, but the way I could best distill this down for you is that there are intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and I'll describe that a little more detail in the next slide, but essentially all motivations have a phase of activation, persistence, and intensity. So this isn't some fleeting thing. There is a level of persistence and intensity that is behind motivations to accomplish what your motivation is. There are these 2 types of motivations, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic are those motivations that are self-needs derived. They are internal to you. They are not accomplished through outside sources, whereas extrinsic motivations, you're motivated by something that is not internal to you. It's not a hope. It's not I want to lose weight, or something that is only you can accomplish from within and through your own efforts. It is something that you can endeavor towards and have a sustained effort to acquire something from the outside, whether it's money or something that can only be achieved through outside sources. And so these are important because that leads to ideation and intention. So when our motivations um, continue, they often cause these thoughts we have about the motivation, and this is known as ideation. It doesn't necessarily move towards action, but you're thinking about, you're kind of focusing on this, and it can come in a lot of different variations. But um, people often have this range of ideation when it relates to the motivations. It could be a mere consideration, could be maybe just a fantasy. Then you see on the other side of that perseveration and intense rumination about motivation. So this is filled with sticky thoughts about how to accomplish and driving themselves towards achieving what they're motivated to do. And that leads to intention. And intention is a bit different than motivation. Sometimes people put these in the same category. They're very different animals. Intention is a prior conscious decision to perform a behavior that is based upon, including other things about a person. It could be their attitudes, values, beliefs, and even their personality and self-concept, some other areas in there. But this is often seen as an antecedent, it leads to behavior. There's an entire model that I didn't include here called the theory of planned behavior that looks at how attitudes, values, beliefs, and motivations can lead towards the behavioral intentionality to perform an action. So with intention, I want to go back to something that the head of PST said: injecting chaos with these attacks, causing influencing fear and chaos in a society. And you look at the intention of reflexive control and causing all these different areas of division, provocation, exhaustion, decision paralysis, overload. This is where the intentionality of these live. It's somewhere between motivation and intention, but the intention, I would argue, for sure, by the point these are created and these attacks are done to shape an outcome causing chaos and injecting fear and influence in a society, this is where reflexive control and these information operation principles live. We then move on to conceptualization, and this is where an attacker solidifies intentions to act, and he or a group or she will contemplate how they'll commit an attack. And it's this conceptualization phase, particularly like with reflexive control, that even if the specific method hasn't been decided upon, the underlying motivation and intention is there. And oftentimes you'll see with digital artifacts, like for instance, the remediation that was done at the Norway Dam, you'll see these artifacts that identify an attacker's conceptualization of what they were trying to do as the means of the attack. And so the research and planning phase of this model is this is the concerted effort to gain information about the selected target and the attack surface to plan the attack. And often you'll see here native knowledge versus research knowledge, meaning someone already has the pre-existing experience, skills, and abilities. Whereas research knowledge, you can get, depending on the artifacts that are collected, whether it's a bash history, search history, other forensic artifacts, you may learn that, hey, the person really didn't have the chops to do it, but they learned how to do it. And I would, again, taking the reflexive control and information warfare principles here, is when you see someone researching and planning and there are artifacts that show selecting the target and attack surface for planning the attack, this is where, what type of effect do I want to cause to inject chaos and fear and challenges societally by attacking critical infrastructure. That's all baked into this process. And then the preparation phase is that particular critical bridge step from cognition to practical implementation. This is where you see mobilization of thought to action. This is when the adversary is acquiring infrastructure, systems, tools, development requirements, channels of attack if there's an information operation component. And often, on an individual level, not as a group or threat actor or country level, but this is where you would expect cognitive dissonance or the hesitation based upon an actor's attitudes and beliefs not aligning with their actions. Usually this is where that's overcome in an attack. When you're talking about a group of criminal actors or nation state actors, this really isn't central to that. But on an individuating level, you would expect to see this. Then with reconnaissance, probing, and breach, this is the prelude to the actual attack. It can vary on a spectrum of invasiveness, often with information-based attacks where there's a influence and chaos injection. You would see narrative testing and different ways of seeing how that particular attack would resonate on a population or the target set or segment. Reconnaissance, this is testing or probing and challenging and making sure that the attack is going to be effective, and when the attack is launched, it will have the impact it's aiming to have. And lastly, before post-attack, we have the attack itself, and this is where the threat actor is executing this plan. So this is a culmination of many things. It's the attacker's time, effort, energy, and focus on the pathway I just described. Unless something challenges it and there's a mitigation or maybe a de-escalation for a particular reason, sometimes we never see what that is, other than you see this entire wave coming and then all of a sudden it de-escalates and there's likely some intermediary step that happens, some event, some effective influence that causes it to stop. And post-attack is how the cyber adversary processes post-attack thoughts, feelings, afterglow, perception management. If you're talking about larger nation state attacks, might be that there's a continuity of the attack or additional victims or additional infrastructure hit, could be destruction of evidence, communication. Communication is important here. I'll give you an example. Looking at the Norway attack, the Russian embassy in Norway released a press release after they were attributed by Norway for the attack, and they downplayed it and said it was a figment of Norway's imagination, and Russia's being blamed baselessly, and it's Norway's problem and not our problem. So that's a post-attack communication piece that you would expect to see. So that's the pathway of cyber attack. The big piece here is looking at that space between motivation and intention, where these deception, influence, and information operation components live, particularly in critical infrastructure attacks, where we know that the attack is not based on traditional cybercrime principles of financial gain. And there I'll stop and take any questions. And again, Tom, this was such a huge pleasure and privilege to be a part of the Secure World Critical Infrastructure virtual conference. Fantastic.